We're just going to go live on that. Takes a second. Okay, Bismillah, alhamdulillah. We are now live on YouTube. And inshallah, those who have the MCWS media account, they will have that. So as I was saying, we felt that this was an important session to have, but we will, inshallah, we have a commitment to have continued programming. And so, you know, Dawood and I have talked, and I've talked with others, with Sheikh Ali, as well as Sheikh Hassan, and inshallah, we will have continued programming dedicated to this very important topic. This is something that should be an ongoing part of our education, because this is not something that's from outside of our community. This is our community. This is our issue. And so it's something that we need to be educated on. So with that, I'm going to have Ria Basha is going to be our moderator today. Ria is from the Southeast Michigan community. Alhamdulillah, she just graduated from the University of Michigan undergraduate and will be going to the law school, inshallah, in the fall at the University of Michigan. She's currently a paralegal with the Philadelphia DA's office, which is a significant district attorney's office, simply because of who was elected there. Okay, alhamdulillah, I see that Mark has also joined us. And a lot of the reforms that we're talking about, at least the Krasner, who was elected to that position, was elected on that platform. Now, whether he implements everything or not, we'll see. But we do know that he has tried to implement some of the reforms that he talked about, which were significant reforms. And of course, I'll let the panelists talk about that. So with that, I'll let Ria take it, inshallah. And alhamdulillah, we have all of our panelists with us.
Alaikum, please forgive me.
Walaikum salam. No problem.
No worries. All right, assalamu alaikum, everyone, bismillah. And thank you, Harris Uncle, for having me. And like he mentioned, I'll be starting at U of M in the fall, and I'm a friend of the Canton community at MCWS. So really happy to be here with you all. And a little embarrassed to be talking, but just the timekeeper, because we have three really excellent and brilliant guests that are going to share their insights with us tonight. We begin in the name of Allah, and we begin just under 2 weeks after the murder of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police, and Breonna Taylor in Louisville before him, and Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia. And Imam Dawood also reminded us today that we're just about 20 years out from the killing of our brother Amadou Diallo in New York at the hands of the New York Police Department. So this is, I mean, the police brutality and the killing with impunity is an issue that is close to home. Here in Detroit, Ayanna Stanley Jones was a 7-year-old girl that was shot by the Detroit Police Department in 2010. Aurora Rosser in Ann Arbor. So when you know, Harris Uncle says that this is our issue, this is something that happens in our backyards. Like he mentioned, I'm just going to lay a bit of groundwork here for those of us who are not Black. I am coming from, you know, just spent a year in Philadelphia working at the DA's office, and it was really in more ways than one a life-changing experience. But Philly is one of the centers of Black Muslim life in the country. And when I was thinking today about systemic Black oppression and what that means and what that looks like, there was one story that came to mind. And my second day on the job, I was assigned to Krasner as a progressive DA. We pride ourselves, I think, on being a reform-minded office, but at the end of the day, we're still prosecutors. So I was assigned to watch a confession video of a 17-year-old Black man from West Philadelphia who was accused of murder. And I work in the post-conviction unit, so this was actually 15 years after the case, and the case had some major holes in it, and this confession video was actually that was being scrutinized, and whether it was coerced or what the case was. So I had to transcribe some portions of it, and it was like 7 hours long again. So I was fast forwarding through some parts because I was sleeping in some points and eating. And I mean, he's locked in this interview room for like an inordinate amount of time. And the police come in and they take his statement. And then, you know, he's left alone in this room. Again, 17 years old, and he puts his jacket on the ground. And I look up and I'm kind of like, what's he doing? You know, what's going on? Next thing I know, this young brother begins to pray. And I'm watching it not in real time, but he says Surah Ikhlas, right, twice in both rak'ah. And that just shook me to my core because he was saying the exact same words that I say 5 times a day. And I mean, just to put that in context, right, he is a young man growing up in the poorest big city in America, served by some of the worst schools and the worst healthcare and one of the most violent police forces in one of the most violent cities in the country. And in his moment of need, he turns back to God. And in his moment of need, he turns back to God in the same way that you and I do. And so when I think about this question of what is our stake, what role do we have to play? I think about that young man and ask myself whether I owe him something, right? Is he not my brother in faith? And so I think for those of us who are not Black, that's really the crux of the issue. And that the command to stand for justice it's a communal one, it's an individual one in the Quran and the Sunnah, and that racial justice in particular is from the Sunnah of our Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. That was one of the things that he came to do. So before we take action, we need knowledge, and that's what we're going to do today, inshallah, to really educate ourselves as to why George Floyd was killed, why this continues to happen, where these roots come from, and what that systemic what that means, what it looks like, the role we have to play in it, and inshallah how we can be a part of undoing it and repairing it. Thankfully, I don't have to be the one talking about that. Because we have our 3 guests today who really need no introduction, but we have Imam Dawood Walid with us from the Canton community and CARE Michigan, Mark Crane, who's the executive director of Dream of Detroit, which is an organization on the west side of the city that works on housing justice and economic dignity, and then Sister Nabintu Dumbia, who is a law student and an organizer with Mass Detroit and the Islamic community of As-Salam, also in Detroit. She is the co-founder of Sisterhood of Yerelan, which is a community initiative providing holistic support to young Black Muslim women, and that name derives from the Mendinka philosophy of knowledge of self. We're really excited to have them with us, and I also want to note that, I mean, these are 2 weeks that have been incredibly difficult for the Black community and really the whole pandemic in general, and so that, our 3 guests chose to spend their time with us today and chose to give up their time. I think means that much more. So just a little housekeeping is that we're going to have each panelist kind of share some reflections, and then the second half will be more of like a interview discussion type of thing, and then the last half hour we'll block off for questions and answers. So if you have questions that come up while you're watching, I think they can message me, right? And I'll keep an eye on that. But without further ado, we'll have Imam Dawood, if you want to take it over.
Actually, just on that, yeah, and most of our audience is used to this, but use the Q&A, please, for questions, not the chat. And then, inshallah, that way we can organize it, and Ria can filter through them, inshallah. Jazakallah khair.
Okay, Bismillah.
Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu wa salam ala ashraf al-anbiya wal mursalin. Sayyidina wa nabiyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. For the brothers and sisters who are watching right now, may Allah reward you, and may Allah protect your families and those whom you love. I've been talking a lot about this issue the last week at least. I was on a platform today coming out of London talking about it. I was doing something yesterday with the New Jersey community and Sheikh Yasser Fahmy and with some other CARE colleagues in Houston and other places. And I was talking more that time about the history of anti-Black violence in America, state-sanctioned anti-Black violence and systems of violence against people of African descent in America. I've also been talking about some of the spiritual maladies that inform racism on a metaphysical level. But I think what I'm just going to do very briefly is not be academic to talk about statistics or talk of or quote something from Quran and Hadith, but tell you a personal story. And I'm going to share this with you. And my family knows about this, and only a few of my friends, and I think this is the first time I've discussed this publicly that I can think of. So my father, who was an activist in his own right, he was involved in civil rights protests as well as peace protests relating to the Vietnam War. And when he was getting his MBA, my father got his master's degree in business administration from the University of Michigan Ann Arbor. He was arrested during a protest by campus police. This is in the early 70s, maybe in 71 or so. And yes.
I'm sorry, but your connection seems to be a little bit choppy. If there's anything you can do to adjust it, yeah. Because we really want to hear it.
Is this better now? Can you all hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. So my father got arrested during a peace protest in Ann Arbor, and alhamdulillah, he years later he ended up getting a very high position with the state of Michigan and working for international trade and commerce, helping to develop business interests in the state of Michigan. He was first, his zone was in the Middle East. My father spent time in Saudi Arabia as well as the Emirates, and later on he got shifted to West Africa. He was spending time in Nigeria, predominantly during that time, but he also was spent time in Senegal as well as in Zimbabwe. So in the year 1988, there was a white woman who was a student at the University of Michigan who didn't come back, I guess, back to her boyfriend when she was supposed to. And when he came and questioned her, he said that she was raped by a Black man. So they took her to the hospital. They gave her the rape test kit. Then the police came and they showed her a photo album of different people. She said she was raped by a Black man, and she happened to point her finger of a picture of my father from about 16 years earlier. The police came, they arrested my father, and at gunpoint, they put his picture on TV and in the paper. He lost basically everything. I didn't know where he was at. I was in Virginia. I was calling my father. He wasn't answering. I was calling my grandmother. My grandmother knew, but she didn't want to tell me what happened to my father. I ended up finding out later what happened to my father. My father ended up beating the case, but he went to court. And it came back that, of course, it wasn't his blood type. And then later on, it came out that actually she had consensual sex with someone else. He gets out of jail and tries to get his life back together. He didn't get his job back. The Washtenaw County prosecutor refused to prosecute her for giving false testimony. And he had to start over again with basically nothing. And then my father is also driving a car, a blue car. I guess some sort of crime took place in Detroit with a Black man driving a blue car in the area. The police pull up on my father, and he's already been traumatized and victim. They pulled up with guns out and said, "Nigga, get on the ground and we're gonna kill you." These are the type of things that so many countless Black men have had to go through in America. And to paint a picture for you, it's not just for the so-called people in the bad neighborhood living bad. My father has a bachelor's degree from Virginia State University, a master's degree in political science from University of Wisconsin-Madison, an MBA from the University of Michigan, a master's degree in special education from the University of Detroit, a master's degree in psychology and a PhD in psychology, no criminal record, clean as a whistle, and this happened to him. I myself grew up in the city of Richmond during the time of the war on drugs. And this came out recently in the news, but we knew about it, where the police department in the city of Richmond would knowingly place drugs on people walking or driving, young Black men during the so-called war on drugs. I myself come from an educated background. Parents, both college graduates. I myself, on more than one occasion, just walking through a certain neighborhood, would have police come. I've had guns pulled on me and been humiliated to have my pants pulled down to my ankles when they look down into my underwear and expose myself, my aura to the public. Till one time, some girls in my school drove by and said, "Oh, that's D, oh, that's messed up." Well, I'm sitting back with my private parts exposed. This is your brother in Islam that this has happened to. It has happened to so many people, where innocent people have been humiliated, beaten, had drugs placed on them, and no consequences for the police. Right now, to this day in Canton, I'm a military veteran. I have education. I don't break the law. To this day, when my eldest son is here with me in Canton, my son Adam, who has such a kind soul, when he says he wants to go jog in Canton, I freak out. Every time that my son goes and tells me he's trying to jog, I have anxiety. And this is long before Ahmed Arbery. Because I know that many people who see him, be it some vigilante type that think he doesn't belong in this area, or a cop who doesn't think that he belongs in this area, that his jogging while Black could get him killed. My wife has been with me sitting at Dearborn, just sitting. Sometimes when police come, I have anxiety. I remember one time we were sitting and the Dearborn police came by. We were sitting somewhere at night, and I told her just to sit and be quiet. I was sitting there quietly to myself, saying the Shahada. Because at that moment in time, I believed that I was going to be martyred. For many of you, maybe this COVID-19 situation was very stressful. For me, it was a refuge being in the house, because for a whole month, I didn't see police. I didn't see police for a whole month. When I see police, it's like a life or death situation how I treat it. And I'm not breaking any laws. I'm your brother. And many people, your brothers and sisters in Islam, have these types of fears about their children, about themselves, have gone through these situations, and we have personally known people who got unjustly convicted and killed by law enforcement. I can think of about 4 people off the top of my head who were killed unarmed by police, 2 of them Muslim, that I knew personally. So this is just the reality. It's not a situation. This is something, when people say the system is broken in America, I said, no, the system is operating how it was designed. The same mentality of the overseers on plantations that would try to keep Black people in check and tried to capture or kill the runaway slave. The overseer became the officer, overseer, officer, overseer, officer. That's where you need to understand how policing takes place relating to Black communities and Black bodies in America. For African Americans like me, or for people like Ahmadou Diallo, who was an immigrant from Guinea, who got shot 41 times by the New York Police Department, or Mohammed Ba, an immigrant from West Africa that was killed a couple years ago, filled up with bullets by the NYPD. Or Yasin Mohammed, who was just fatally shot last month in Georgia, immigrant from Sudan. This is what we face here in America. So just think about the stress that some of you may feel when you're driving across the border to Canada, coming back, or flying back in the country from traveling overseas, visiting family in Pakistan, coming back from business from the Gulf countries. I want you to imagine that tension that you feel at that moment. Multiply that by about 5 times, and then imagine feeling that way every day of your life living here. That's the way I feel. So with that, I will stop and let the other sister and brother speak. Sorry for raising my voice.
Thank you, Imam Dawood. That was hard because you're not just a brother in faith to me, but you're my uncle and one of the leaders in our community. And that's, I don't know. Nabintu, we'll hear from you next, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'd like to start off by thanking the Canton community, MCWS, all of my fellow panelists, the organizers. I think it's probably an understatement, and I hope goes without saying how difficult the past almost 2 weeks has been. I know not only on me and my community, but I think as reflected by this event, the entire Muslim community at large, and I think and I hope the country, if not the world. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Oh my Lord, expand for me my chest, ease my task for me, and untie the knot from my speech that they may understand what I say. So as I was thinking about today and truly just reflecting and kind of trying to figure out the best way to, I think, just approach this topic, what came to my mind was the society that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam came to and found, and that he preached his message to. And specifically, I thought about how pre-Islamic Arab society was predominantly dependent on its clan-based societal structure, who people were, their ancestral links, and sort of the interconnectedness between them could, and in fact would, determine an individual's faith or fate from the very beginning of their life until they took their very last breath. And so in thinking about this reality, I began to imagine how could any belief system that was tasked with redirecting the most innate compass in the children of Adam alayhi salam not have simultaneously been an action-driven system with its roots firmly planted in justice. So this idea that the religion of Islam could not have looked any other way than one that would come to not merely amend existing laws, give out a couple of monetary charity funds, and make politically correct recommendations to oppressive rulers of its time. Islam could not have looked like anything else besides a revolutionary command that it was, armed with the most timeless call that ever was and that ever will be. This idea that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one, and this command that, if necessary, We must flip society as we know it on its head if that's what it takes to get back to the divinely ordered position of enjoining what is good and forbidding all that is evil. And so when you put that into context, and specifically pre-Islam Arab society, you begin to think about the fact that when a society is found to be burying their daughters alive, the solution could never be to organize around taking away people's shovels, right? The question that must be asked is one that sees these actions, as disturbing as they may be, and to understand them as a symptom of a greater problem. It must be this question that brings us closer to showing no mercy and how we tackle root causes that lead to such an oppressive state, like being able to bury another human being alive. So I think that when we make the decision to look at the roots of the issues that are presented before us, we necessarily look into the mirror. We become exposed to greed and persistent denial and a commonly unknown shirk in the form of egotism and arrogance. And in doing so, from that, I think that the long established reality of anti-Black racism in this country is actually not that difficult to understand as systemic when we start to make the conscious decision to reject any idea that asks us to view racism through the lens of its symptoms, right? It's this rejection of shallow solutions that look like book drives to your local Detroit public school, while turning a blind eye to the fact that reading levels of Black boys are used in how assessments are made for how many prisons will be built in the upcoming year. It's this rejection that any baseless thought process that pushes an American dream narrative, because we know by now that Black Americans have made up 13% of this country's population while only being given access to 2.7% of its wealth. It's knowing that, or knowing how to interact with the reality that Black immigrants possess higher rates of educational degree attainment than any other immigrant group in this country. Yet those same Black immigrants earn lower wages than any other similarly trained immigrants and have the highest unemployment rates of any foreign-born group in this country. It's this reminder that whenever and wherever any other community has experienced government surveillance, there was a J. Edgar Hoover armed with a COINTELPRO to not merely silence Black activists like Imam Jamil El-Amin, who is still incarcerated as we speak, but to launch a persistent attack that ideally would completely eradicate any way, shape, or form of Black leadership that's rooted in Black empowerment. And I think that finally, as I desperately hope we know by now, if we didn't know before, this refusal to stop at viewing the symptoms of our critical understanding of anti-Black racism in this country as an act of resistance that forces us to reflect on, to know, to say, and to never forget that the symptoms like law enforcement as we know it in this country was never crafted with any intent to protect Black men like George Floyd or Amadou Diallo, or Black women like Breonna Taylor. Rather, what we do have before us and what we do know at this point is that there is a hyper-aggressive criminal justice system that responds to the use, something as basic as the use of a counterfeit bill with an inherently anti-Black police tactic that directly leads to the murder of Black men, Black women, and Black children like Tamir Rice. And so I think that if we begin to take this seriously, if we begin to take this call of not stopping at symptoms, not looking at how these things manifest, but rather to actually force ourselves to look at the roots, to see where these things come from, then we will finally be able to get to a place where we recognize that the Prophet ﷺ could not have and would not have merely came and told people to just stop burying their daughters. He knew that it had to go deeper than that. And I hope that through assessing the systemic roots of anti-Black racism, we're able to do something similar. We're able to prevent ourselves or to stop allowing ourselves to stop at shallow conversations in our communities, but to really get at the root and to really start to understand where these things derive from and how they continue to kill our fellow Black brothers and sisters.
Thank you so much, Nabintu. That's something I've actually been thinking a lot about in the last days as well. Umar radiallahu anh committed female infanticide as well, right? But what is the power of this revelation that we have that made him someone who would cry when he heard that someone was hungry in a city? That's something to really reflect on and some food for thought. Thank you. Mark, take us home. Well, not yet, but halfway at least.
Yeah, not quite taking us home. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. Very, very grateful as usual to join this community for another program. So I want to mention, and then I'm eager to get to the questions part of this, to be frank, but I want to mention just a couple of things. I want to talk about the terminology that we use, at least open up that conversation. I'm sure we can dig into it more in the Q&A. A little bit about Detroit in particular and our history in this city. And then, some of what this moment calls for from us. And I think I can only start to express some of that in this opening, at least. And so, one thing I want to name is just one of the things that I think is really a sad byproduct of our information age is like the collection of information without the ability to contextualize it, or the collection of it through independent learning that then the learner isn't fully doesn't get the full context, doesn't get the full meaning, doesn't get the nuances. And we talk about this obviously in our in terms of religious studies a lot in our community. But this is the same when it comes to social studies. And part of the polarization of our times is that because everything is sort of accessible in a way, people are learning words, but they're not learning meanings, or they're reading words and having misunderstandings, or they're hearing stories and not checking facts. So I want to just start with a couple of terms, and then I'll end with a couple of terms. So first is just this basic idea, right? That what racism is this marriage of policies and ideas that produces and then makes it seem normal to have inequitable outcomes for different racial groups, for different classifications of people. Doesn't matter if those classifications are based on things that we would call invalid. What matters is that they're being used to produce real world outcomes, right? And in this country, the history of racism tied to policy has always been linked to the interests of what we would call the system of white supremacy. Now, racist ideas, they take hold in the hearts of policymakers. Those ideas become policy, and then they reinforce the wrong ideas. So there's this cycle that we've been stuck in for literally hundreds of years. And to be racist is simply to be one who is supporting racist policies, either through action or inaction, or expressing a racist idea. That might seem a little harsh because we've accepted the idea that racist is actually like a pejorative term, like it's an insult to call someone racist. Really, it's not. Really, what we're acknowledging is that, as Imam Dawood mentioned, the whole system is designed a particular way. If the system is designed a certain way and you act according to that system, it's not an insult to you to acknowledge how you're being impacted by that system, right? The idea is that once we have had an awakening, moments like these produce awakenings, the right khutbah produces an awakening, but once we've had an awakening, that I'm harboring ideas that contribute to these unequal outcomes, that contribute to the direct harm of folks when these policies come to real life, then you attempt to become an anti-racist, right? Then you intend to be someone who is intentionally supporting through action policies that challenge racial inequity in the country, right? Or you're expressing an anti-racist idea. You're expressing an idea that challenges common assumptions that are held about entire groups of people. So, this is to be clear that to be anti-racist or to be opposed to racism is never to conflate racist people with white people, right? We know that there are anti-racist white folks and there are racist non-white folks, right? The point is um, sometimes we like to focus on the experience of our white brothers and sisters and their individuality. And we'll say, you know, I know such and such, and it sure doesn't seem like they had a privileged life. You know, I can't deal with this term white privilege. It doesn't apply to everyone. You would offend them to say that. And frankly, like in these, particularly in these moments, but I'll be real with you, in my life, I'm less concerned with the idea of peeling back the layers on one individual's life and the ways in which they might have benefited from society. I'm actually less concerned with that than I am with, you know, all of the Jermaines and the Tyrells and the Jihads who didn't get that job, whose resume didn't make it to that next round because they had a Black sounding name, right? That to statistically significant degrees, folks are facing job discrimination because of the culture that their name is related to, right? I'm worried about folks who are being sent home in a time of COVID because they're, you know, the symptoms of pain that they're describing aren't being taken seriously enough, because studies have shown that doctors will tend to under-medicate Black patients out of assuming that there's some increased, you know, ability to withstand the pain. I'm worried about, you know, all the brothers in the park who asked someone to do something, you know, to abide by the law and to do something that's common courtesy, and who had the cops on them and had an entirely different outcome, right? Why did the woman do that act that she went into when she called the police? Because she knew the outcome that she was provoking by putting on that act. She knew exactly what she was doing. Did we all see a couple of years ago that the woman whose husband and friend killed Emmett Till, that she admitted that she lied on stand about what she said happened that day, right? So there's a long-standing history of invoking a sort of victimhood, and it plays out through institutional violence against Black folks. That's what I'm worried about. And I'll deal, of course, with everyone on an individual basis, but we really need to start thinking about systems. We need to start thinking about how the system has inequities, how policies reinforce that, and how we challenge those policies to create a better system. And of course, we treat every individual like a human being, and we treat them with love and respect and dignity and kindness, and we assume the best of them, right? Of course, but like we need to be focused on inequitable systems. So I'll mention just a couple of things. Maybe there's more time to talk about Detroit in particular, but this is a city that we have to realize has a long history of entrenched racism. And it's a city, you know, there's nuance here, of course, because it's also a city that really does represent Black political power in this country. But it's a city where we deal with realities of the fact that Black folks in the city have never had access to equitable housing, neither in the city nor in the suburbs. That in 1947, there were 545,000 housing units available in the Detroit area, and only 47,000 were available to Black people, right? We deal with the fact that, you know, that Ossian Sweet had a mob form outside of his home when he moved into his house on the neighborhood and broke the color line in the city of Detroit. That the Sojourner Truth Homes, a public housing project, had a white mob riot outside of it because they didn't want it close to their neighborhood in the city of Detroit, right? We think about the fact that that in the city of Detroit, Black folks have been systematically kept out of construction trades. And it's reinforcing, because then what happens? Then you build a new stadium and the contractors say, oh, well, we can't hire enough Black folks or enough resident Detroiters. We don't have the numbers. And it's like, well, because you've been keeping folks out of the unions to protect your contracts for all these years, right? And it plays out in these critical ways in which we just don't have the same types of access and in which we're separated. Thomas DeGroot talks about the spatial barriers of race, and in Detroit, that's incredibly, you know, poignant. And we can talk more about how the overwhelming differences in racial composition between the city and the suburbs, or how you look at the history of Black folks in the city, and from our start over on the Near East Side out to Southfield and Oak Park in the western burbs, we've been following basically a path that Jewish folks have blazed, because we actually couldn't get into other neighborhoods. And it's not that there was that much less racial intolerance between Jewish folks and Black folks, but Jewish folks at the time had a lot less overt power to enact that, right? So white communities could say, we're going to have these racial covenants, we're going to have these realtors agree to certain things, et cetera, and the Jewish community couldn't. So you see this pattern where we are sort of tied together by that yoke. So let me just start to close by pivoting to this moment in Detroit. Again, Detroit's an interesting place because, you know, our first Black mayor, Coleman Young, you know, when he was elected, ran, you know, on a comprehensive policy. I mean, the man was a skilled orator and labor leader and civil rights leader for decades before running for mayor. But he ran partially on disbanding a unit in the Detroit police called the Stress Unit. And, you know, we do this thing with police accountability and police brutality every decade, if, you know, if not more frequently than that. I mean, it's a constant, right, in some of our lives. But like, I mean, the outrage, the uprising. When it comes to Detroit, we're talking about a police force that's over 60% Black. So what I want to indicate here is that there is something about having political power and being able to have people who reflect the communities that they serve in office, in elected office, and in uniformed office. It's really important. However, you know, and we can talk about the nuances of public safety and what's necessary there. But in this moment, what folks are calling for nationally is a call to defund the police, right? That's what folks are calling for nationally. And that might sound a little bit radical, like until you actually start to break it down into what does that mean for me locally? That means that we're gonna, you know, hopefully stop suspending licenses in Detroit for parking tickets, which is one of the highest determinants of folks ending up in jail in this area, right? Simple things that generate revenue for departments that are ruining people's lives, simple things. It means freeing people from Wayne County Jail during COVID, right? We've seen a huge release. I think you can argue that the jail should have been empty faster, and that we should do as much as possible to get the numbers down. I think that you know, when we talk about ending support for surveillance in the city of Detroit, the Green Light Project, you know, depending on who you talk to, is this thing that's going to help our businesses ward off crime. But on the other hand, it's this system that's feeding private video feeds into this central database that, you know, folks with police authority can monitor at their will, and then they will in fact develop contracts to share with private entities, and all sorts of things will come from this sort of surveillance. So there are, I think, under the banner of defund the police, ideas that all of us could probably find, you know, very reasonable to agree with. And then there are some that you may disagree with. But, you know, when we talk about this moment, when we talk about the fact that the police have too much money, they didn't need a Predator drone flying over Minneapolis, right? When you see, you know, some of the montages of officers attacking protesters, like literally physically and violently, you know, they really don't need tanks on civilian streets. They really don't need the level of offensive military weaponry that's available because we have the Pentagon sending weapons of war to our local police departments. Cut that program off. That's the way you can defund the police. Cut that stop designing and producing these weapons, but then stop them from being given from the Pentagon to our police departments. So I'll wrap there, but I just want to reiterate for folks, like, you know, part of this moment is just learning. And, you know, Malcolm said, right, he said that of all our studies, history is best qualified to reward our research. The truth is that, like, a lot of us just need to start with some basic history. We need to get a basic set of facts, and we can go deeper into those facts and more local into those facts and with more texture into those facts as much as we can do that. But a lot of us just need to start with basic history and actually leave some of the conversations around social theory and critical race theory and so forth alone. Some folks need to be in those conversations, and there's always been public debates between intellectuals. There's always been debates about which direction movement should go and which direction academic language should go and so forth between folks who have studied. But some of us really just need to learn basic history, and we need to build relationships with people. Just build relationships with people on the ground. Muslims who are non-Black, build relationships with Black Muslims, not just in these heightened moments, but authentic relationships all the time, right? Like, you know, so I want to end there, you know, because I think we get lost in the terminology, we get lost in heady concepts, and really it would be so much easier. We're inclined toward justice, and it would be so much easier to help bring it about just through relationship building and through avoiding some of the hypotheticals that harm us. So I'll stop there, and Jazakallah khair.
Well, yeah. So thank you, all of you, for sharing your thoughts and words that really, I think, came from your heart. I have a few questions of my own, but for everyone who's here, if you have questions, please drop them in the Q&A. I want to say too that this is a brave space, so ask what you feel like you need to be answered, things you're confused about, terms you may have heard. Mark got us a little bit of the way there, talking about racism and what it means to be racist. But if you hear words you don't understand, that's what this time is for. And then questions in particular about how we can move from this moment as a community in our understanding, but also our action. So I want to just really basic, going back to the terminology. When we say systemic oppression, what is a system? What kinds of systems are we talking about, and where? Well, yeah, let's start there, and then I have a follow-up. And how do those systems interact with each other, for whoever wants to take it?
I think I can start, and then I think handing it off to, I think, Mark, you touched on a lot of this. I will say, I think the easiest way to answer this question is every single system you can think of, right? So whether that is the wealth gap, whether we're talking about employment, housing discrimination, I mentioned government surveillance, incarceration, every single system that we can think of as it exists and as we know it, right? Immigration policy is another example. We know that Black immigrants are detained at higher levels, more aggressive measures are used with Black immigrants than any other immigrant group, right? So every single system, level that you can think about, whether it is locally or nationally, are the exact systems that we're referring to. I think that the pandemic that we find ourselves in right now, and in our specific context in Michigan, where we know that African Americans represent under 14%, 13.6% of the population, but we're 40% of the deaths, of the COVID deaths, right? So that's like a perfect example of how not only will these racial disparities present themselves in every single system at every single level, but anytime something like a global pandemic happens, it must show, and it always will show through those issues, because of, by virtue of, if access is not a thing, then people will die at higher rates, people will be incarcerated at higher rates, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in. You know, I think when we talk about systemic racism, you know, and of course, like the racism is both systemic and systematic, right? But like the phrase we typically say is systemic racism to talk about how it's rooted in these institutions. But like we see the same things play out over and over again, like almost systematically. But systemic racism, I mean, I think really what it's rooted in is racist policy, right? So, you know, there's a different dynamic if, you know, if there is racist discrimination happening between two groups of people who have an equal ability to affect each other's outcomes. It's different if those racist ideas are then being turned into racist policy proposals, which get voted and become racist laws. And then those racist laws are furthermore being implemented by people with deep biases in their hearts, right? And then again, it's that cycle that we talked about. But you know, I think thinking about institutional racism or systemic racism in terms of racist policy and how is the state, the government, you know, these entities that we cede so much control over our lives to, how are those very entities involved in producing, you know, situations where white wealth is 10 times the amount of Black wealth, or where, as Nabintu mentioned, folks in Detroit are dying at, or really all over the country, dying at much higher rates, you know, when it comes to COVID. So yeah, racist policy is the phrase that I would try to leave people with when they think about systemic racism.
I agree with both what Sister Nabintu and Brother Mark said. May Allah protect them and protect their families. I would say, and we're talking, and I want to make 2 points. One, we're talking about this situation being systemic racism. I also want to be very clear when we're talking about systems and we're talking about how this influenced public policy. This is not just simply a right-wing thing. This is not just something that is isolated to so-called conservatives or so-called Republicans, or I see some people online pointing that this is Trump's America. No, this is Democrat America and Republican America. This is so-called liberal America, like Amy Cooper, who donated to Pete Buttigieg and Hillary Clinton and campaigned for Obama and probably dated a black guy and at the same time called the police on the Harvard graduate bird watcher in New York. It's just like how Malcolm X's critique was over 55 years ago when he talked about the wolf and the fox, right? And wolves and foxes both will eat your chickens if you have a chicken coop, right? One just howls and the other one smiles. But this is something that's systemic and probably, and one of the greatest proliferations of mass incarceration in the United States of America took place under a so-called liberal who liked to eat chicken wings and play the saxophone. That was Bill Clinton, right? So I want you to also believe that people who call themselves Democrats have been in cahoots with the same system to marginalize Black life, just like Republicans, right? There's not that much there's not really any fundamental difference, historically speaking. The other point is that when we're talking about systemic racism in public policy, there is something else that goes along with it. And that is the cultural racism that helps support and advance the systemic racism in public policy. When you have private entities, when you have entities like the media, when you have entities like Hollywood, when you even have entities that we love watching, like the NFL, and we saw what happened to Colin Kaepernick, right? But where these entities themselves help bolster and even help to support the systemic racism on a policy level, even how they frame things historically, right? Like, so for instance, you will see different language, even in regards to protests and the different language that's used by corporate media. I mean, no tear gas got shot on those people carrying AK-47s that went to the state capitol holding nooses and Confederate flags. But then the other people are called looters, right? They're supposed to be violent, where in fact the police come out with military tactics, and they're trained by the Israeli occupational forces, by the way, too. They come out with military tactics, come and provoke peaceful protesters, even start to hit peaceful protesters, shoot tear gas, and then when the protesters respond, or maybe there's some property damage, then those people are called the violent looters. You see how the framework is racist and the media is in cahoots with the system. So that's very important for us to understand, that systemic racism is supported by cultural racism in the United States of America.
Yeah, I think, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'll just mention, that point is really important, about media complicity in this project, right? And, so much about the way we live is based on like the common narratives that we hear in media. But it's not just like Hollywood media, it's also our news media, right? And there's the like really extreme examples of like Fox News, for instance, which like we all have to know at this point is not real news, right? There are the examples that are a little bit smooth, like Sinclair Corporation, which owns a bunch of local news channels and will syndicate, racist segments over these local news channels. But I want to read a quick quote from Coleman Young, actually, and he talks about the Detroit News, and he says, and this is, he says that Michael McCormick, the news editor, outlined a news gathering strategy that isolated the booming suburbs as the paper's target audience. He said, keep a lookout for and then play well the stories aimed at this group. Then he said, speaking of other stories, he said they should be obvious. They won't have a damn thing to do with Detroit and its internal problems, right? So looking for stories that don't shine any good light on the city itself, looking for stories that particularly appeal to suburban audiences. And I'll give you a real life example of this. There was a guy who I had the chance to meet him later in life, but when I was growing up, Emery King was always on Channel 4, right? A fixture in our households if you watch Channel 4 News. Emery left Channel 4 under, on bad terms with the station. And, one of the things that, that I learned from him later was he tells a story of after the shooting at Hart Plaza in like the early 2000s, there was a producer at the news station who sent him on assignment out to somewhere in Clinton Township, I believe it was, to interview this particular white woman about why she would never allow her children to go into Detroit again to experience the fireworks. Right, this is the early 2000s, and look at how the lengths that we have to go through to manufacture the type of story that denigrates Detroit with these racist overtones. And Emery asked him, okay, I'll do the story if when I come back to the studio, I get to ask you on camera why that was a newsworthy segment, right? And when you start to push back like that, you don't stay at the station very much longer. But the point just being that like this stuff is totally embedded in our media system.
Yeah, I think there are two kind of common mistakes we make when we talk about this, like the system, right? And the first is that it becomes very amorphous, right? It's just like this big blob. The system did it, right? The state did it. But I think what Nabintu pointed out so well is that it's really these social services and or lack thereof that we participate in every day, right? That some schools are better than others, right? That some neighborhoods are more surveilled than others. And I think it speaks to maybe like a lack of imagination, even in some ways, where we question what would it mean to defund the police when we live in, I live in Bloomfield. I could go weeks without seeing a cop car, right? So I think that's really important is to particularize what we're talking about. And then the second, I think, mistake that we often make is that of like pathology, right? Black people are poorer because they are lazy, right? Or that they suffer from higher, I haven't seen this take yet, but I'm sure it's out there, that they suffer from higher rates of COVID because they have, poorer life, like less healthy lifestyles, for example. And I think that's where history is really important to peel back the roots of where that comes from, and that that white supremacist ideology has mutated over time, and it's more about the policy than any particular person. And that pathology is something that's really common, I think, even in the Arab and Desi community. So thank you. Actually, Mark, if you could give us maybe just a little bit more history on like white flight in Detroit, why it looks the way it does, and maybe if you could even tie in a little bit of like the Muslim community and because right, that 1967, 1968, that was a really pivotal time in Detroit's history, but you also had an influx of immigrants, right? If you could speak a little bit to that.
Sure thing. Let me first just say it while it's on my mind. When we talk about defunding the police, I want to be clear that like everyone in this particular moment does not have to become all of a sudden a racial justice activist. I want to be really clear about that. You do not all of a sudden have to be on the front lines. You should not even think that you have the ability to be stepping into strategy conversations amongst folks who are active in these movements. But like, you don't have the responsibility to be a racial justice activist all of a sudden. You do have a responsibility. If this moment has actually really stirred you, if what you're hearing from our shayuk is really stirring you, you do have a responsibility to actually, I would argue, practice being an anti-racist, practice commenting, practice speaking up when you see racist ideas being proffered, practice speaking up when you see racist policies being proposed by politicians that you're donating to when you go to their social hours and their fundraisers. Practice pointing out soft racism, if you will, in your area. Some people say, oh, symbols don't mean a whole lot, but I promise you they do. And violence looks different in different places. You know, I've told folks sometimes the story of going to school in Cranbrook and Bloomfield Hills, and in the early 2000s we still had a statue of Robert E. Lee on campus. Not only just a statue of Robert E. Lee in a building that every student had to walk through every day, but a statue that said "Teacher of the Youth," no less. Can you imagine the impact of this type of image on the psyche of young Black students day in and day out? So, and it shouldn't have taken Black 16 and 17-year-olds to organize to get that statue taken away. Where were the white parents? Where were the donors? Where were the people who are paying for the institution? So I want to put those points out there before I forget them. And then I'll just say, you know, when it comes to Detroit, I mean, incredibly rich history. Definitely suggest folks read books like Origins of the Urban Crisis by Thomas Segru, read books like Black Detroit by Herb Boyd. You know, when it comes to Islam in the city, you know, read books like Sally Howell's Old Islam in Detroit, and you know, obviously sit with our elders who are here to keep telling us these stories. But you know, read the independent writings of brothers like Fahad Ahmed or Akil Fahad rather, who's down in Atlanta now, but can just tell you so much textured Detroit Muslim history, especially. But you know, just the short of it is, again, the city is a story of race in America. The city is a story of Black labor producing immense wealth and Black folks being systematically kept out of that wealth. The city is a story of, you know, an emblem of white flight nationally, where in this huge influx of wealth and prestige and global prestige after World War II, caused a huge expansion into the suburbs for white communities, and then subsequently model minority communities, while very actively, deliberately, on purpose, holding back money, not guaranteeing people's loans, kept Black folks in substandard housing in inner city neighborhoods and communities, right? And again, Detroit is a perfect example of it. We all know the dividing line that 8 Mile has come to represent in our heads, because it actually is that dividing line historically in this area. You know, we know, you know, the histories of particular cities that, you know, as late as the late 90s and early 2000s, we considered sundown towns. You know, we didn't drive into Livonia if you didn't need to, let alone after dark, right? Times change, and of course, and then there are ways that people and times don't change, and you have to be cognizant of that, even as things look different, you know, some years later. But yeah, the history of, again, racism in Detroit strongly tied to the wealth created out of industrialization and the specific ways that Black folks, even though prime sources of labor, were kept out of that wealth, the way housing was systematically cut off from certain groups of folks. And then the way that the city was divested and actively divested in after. People say, oh, well, why didn't New York rebound it after the 70s? Why couldn't Detroit rebound? You wanna know why Detroit couldn't rebound? Because despite the gifted politician and orator he was, Detroit was under the leadership of a man named Coleman Young, who was unabashedly Black, who, like I said, ran on stopping police brutality in 1972, and who people didn't want to cede power to. At a time when the city still had 1.2, 1.3 million people, the suburbs thought they could strong-arm Detroit into giving up more than 50% of control of a mass transit project. And what other city in America do we see that, right? But it was the fact that it was a Black man in the mayor's office who would have been wielding that power. I'll end with this. Judge Fiken was a federal judge who took control of Detroit's water system away from the city a few years into Coleman Young's term, and didn't give it back to the city until Mayor Duggan was in office. Took the water system into a type of federal receivership. And what we have to realize is, you know, we actually don't have to realize this, but to defend him, Coleman Young balanced the budget of Detroit every single year that he was in office. You could say what you want about, you cannot say that he was a poor administrator, right? But again, you know, hopefully incidents like what we are seeing right now, hopefully the blatant nature of those also help us see the more subtle forms of racism.
Thank you. I'll ask one more question about the problem, and then a bulk of the questions actually are about solutions and action. I'm wondering if you all have an answer to, there is a particularly Muslim way of like all lives mattering, the issue of police brutality, where, you know, you'll compare what happens here to Palestine, right? Like this happens in Palestine every day, right? Or this happens around the Muslim world every day. And I think actually that to me is more a statement of like global solidarity than it is a reason to look away from what happens here. But I'm wondering if you all could maybe comment on where that line lies, right? Don't all,
Dawood, you want to, yeah, maybe Dawood wants to address it, but I can give a little bit more color to this because I've been seeing it more recently. Is that giving the pictures of the Israeli soldiers on the necks of Palestinians, and pointing that out, and then saying, well, this is an issue. Why are we talking about it here when it's being done globally? So maybe Dawood, you can start to comment on it.
I was actually going to defer it to Nabintu or Assistant Nabintu or Brother Mark regarding that. I can't say actually what motivates people to draw those comparisons, all lives matter comparisons pointing overseas. But what I can say is that those types of conversations could lend themselves to easily not taking responsibility for what's going on right here in America and what's going on in our backyard to actually deal with the reality of what takes place here, right? So we talk about and point to something that's going on over there. They say, oh, well, this same thing is going on over there, or this sort of thing is going on over there, and this catastrophe is going on over there, even to the point of sometimes pointing at what's going over there as being worse. And it's used as a tool or as a deflection of not really dealing with the issue at hand here. And that's the way that I interpreted some of that. I actually heard a very good analogy of this earlier, that, about all lives, this all lives matter type of discourse, where you're talking about there's houses on fire, right? And you're saying that there's houses on fire, but then you go into a particular neighborhood, a particular area. And then the neighborhood and the area you go in, you say that, oh, we have a whole bunch of houses on fire everywhere, but in the right neighborhood you go into, only the black house is the one is on fire. But then you want to talk about all of these house fires everywhere else. But the one fire you see in front of your face that you could work to help put out is the fire in the house of that black home right there, right? That's how I look at this thing when people talk about this all lives matter, or this is going on over there and this is here. Or what about this and what about that and what about that, right? So Allah knows best.
Yeah, I think echo most of that. I also think something that is just a good practice in general when we have those sorts of responses is to really think about where they come from. Because I think if we actually sit with that and if we have these sorts of conversations, whether it's in our families or in our communities and friend groups, what we're realized is that this issue of all lives matter only comes up when we're referring to Black lives. There's no other incident, no other time, no other place where I can even fathom the thought of, being in a conversation or having a Twitter town hall going, or being at a protest about freeing Palestine, as we rightly should, and another issue would come up in an attempt to center that issue right in that moment when it's clear what the main issue is at this, right now. So I think that's important. I actually think that speaks to a lot of the internal work that we need to do, which is this notion that anytime Black people, rightfully so, assert their needs and kind of how we have been failing to really respond to that, we use that as an opportunity to draw analogies and to casually send things into group chat, not even realizing the healing that needs to be done. I think it undermines or it attempts to undermine movements and things that are extremely legitimate. And then I think secondly, the only thing that I will say is, if nothing else, if people don't feel any sort of commitment, I think it's extremely important. I think this goes to the history point, to learn about the fact that like the civil rights movement is directly connected to the influx and immigration that we have witnessed and that we continue to see, that there is no such thing as, you know, the progress that we see here today. All of it rests on the backs of Black people. There's no way to separate ourselves from the fact that we are beneficiaries, and I'm saying we because my parents are immigrants as well, from the Black struggle, from the Black movement. And so I think like when that's our automatic reaction to respond that way, it's important to take a step back and to think about those things.
You know, I will say, I would highly encourage, I hope that like this round of protests and whatever policy changes come out of it, and whatever, you know, heart changes come out of it, that this is the last time. Like, it feels like we're already past it compared to 2016. It feels like we're having less of this all lives conversation and having to push back on that. It feels significantly less to me. But hopefully this is the last time we have to do it at all, particularly in the Muslim community. And, you know, highly encourage folks to watch, you know, Imam Dawood talks about this all the time, you know, the roots of racism and the actions of the shaitan. You know, Sheikh Abdul Karim Yahya gave a great khutbah that's on Dar Rahman's page yesterday, talking about racism in our country. We're talking about khibr in our faith, but like racism in the country as well. You know, Dr. Bilal Ware gave a great talk with Wasit about a week ago that is online. You know, that's a lot of content right there for you to dig into and try to absorb and reflect on. You know, really sit with, like, look over your notes after you watch it a second or third time to make sure that, you know, the parts that you missed get understood. And hopefully we're past this conversation of whether, because, you know, and then just to pivot, you know, Imam Mikhail Sadiq, he said something yesterday in a clip at the Muslim Center, or for the Muslim Center, where he said, like, you know, you really should be able to say Black Lives Matter without having to feel like, without going to a Black Lives Matter chapter meeting, right? Like, again, this is the difference between coming out of this moment as an anti-racist versus a racial justice activist. Nobody's asking you to show up to a chapter meeting. In fact, I'm specifically asking you to talk to your Black Muslim co-religionists, you know, first and immediately, and a commitment for the long term, you know, as a priority. But like, we really should not have a problem saying Black Lives Matter. Making that affirmation, I think, should not be an issue. I'll just also say, you know, there's a spectrum, you know, with how things, you know, can be received, but, you know, generally I think conversations about solidarity are important. I think it's important for us to learn each other's history. It's a part of coming to know one another. I think that, you know, I think that a lot of times people get real up in their headspace when it comes to racial justice stuff, and they'll be like, oh, you know, like it's obviously you should recognize someone's inherent humanity, but like empathy is an actual thing. And like having the ability to relate to people's experiences is a real thing. And that's why, again, building relationships and actually talking to people matters. You know, that softens the heart in ways that like reading every textbook on racism in America just can't do. So I just want to put that out there. I think we disregard the importance of being willing to talk and to teach sometimes.
I am just reading through some of these questions. I like this one a lot, actually. We've been hearing a lot recently about the right and a wrong. There's a right and a wrong way to be an ally and to show solidarity. If you could comment on the best ways that non-Black Muslims can be allies, and if there are ways maybe to not show up.
I personally can't stress the education piece enough. I think that maybe there's some progress, but we are nowhere near where we need or should be for a community that has such a long, I mean, with, you know, putting all of that aside, to be a community that literally has depicted for us so clearly the sin that racism is, right? and that it is of the sunnah of Iblis. Like I think it's extremely concerning to think about the fact that we're still in a place where anti-Black racism is commonplace, or to think about the fact that myself as a Black Muslim, I do think twice about where I'm going to, which masajid I'm going to go to. That is a common thing. Or the fact that it takes more than for Black Muslims to express masajid to not work as closely with law enforcement. The fact that it takes more than that for us to, or the fact that we have to beg to not have cops at Tarawih, that's extremely problematic. And so I think that when we realize that those things still exist, that's an education piece, right? I think that one of the best things, if not the first things that any non-Black Muslim can do right now, is to begin to have these difficult but extremely necessary conversations with their families and in their homes. Speaking as someone who comes from an immigrant family myself, I have to have difficult conversations with my immigrant parents and cousins and aunts and uncles about anti-Black notions, and we are Black immigrants. So I imagine that if that's something I'm doing, and we are all Black skinned, I can't imagine the things that exist in other homes and in other families. I think that is, and to really hone in on Mark's point about the expectation is not for people, the expectation isn't even for you to go to a protest. Like, if that's not your thing, that's fine. But if you're at home and you're in your communities and you're having these difficult conversations and you're making sure that people who are closest to you understand how they perpetuate anti-Blackness, and it's likely that they do, I think that in and of itself is so important in how you can align with the Black Muslim, the Black community in general, and I guess the Black Muslim community here specifically.
I agree with all of what Sister Nabintu said. I would also add on about showing up, and as well as not showing up, that the leaders that we have amongst ourselves who are African American and those institutions that are grassroots, not just here, but across the country, they should be supported. They should be supported morally, and they should also be supported with your financial contributions, just as you would support any other Muslim leadership in the community. So I would say that. And it is, we've been doing better, but I think it's about time that we begin to invest more here in America than sending our money as much abroad. And I would also say that, and this is a number of conversations with my beloved teacher, Sheikh Ali, about really re-looking at how we spend our zakat here in America, and the establishment of waqf, of endowments, and how we could use that zakat to help empower Muslims and help raise people up who have suffered from systemic marginalization here in the United States of America. Your Muslim brothers and sisters, including economic, and Nabintu gave you some statistics, right? In terms of even Black immigrants who are educated who can't find proper employment. But there's ways that we could use our resources to help lift all of us up. Now, I would also say a way and how not to show up is that don't, and Brother Mark touched on it, but don't try to step ahead of and go ahead of your leadership who are Muslims and the organizing activists who are actually Black. Like, don't think you're so woke that you're going to come and lecture Black folks about Black suffering, or that you're going to jump over people in your community to say you're going to go with Black Lives Matter, and then you haven't even worked to establish or take nasiha from your Muslim brothers and sisters who are Black, be they African Americans, be they immigrants and children of immigrants who are Africans, or Black Arabs, because Arabness and Blackness aren't mutually exclusive. We have Sudanese people who are equally Black, equally African, and equally Arab, according to their qabail, according to their tribes, right? So don't jump over us and try to direct us about our own pain, our own suffering. We know what we're dealing with, right? So I would just say that's like how not to show up.
I know we're coming up short on time, so I want to make sure we close out inshallah by 11 o'clock. So I have a few rapid fire ones. If maybe just one person wants to take each of these. And then there's a really good question I think I'll save for the end. Imam Dawood, how can we align with Black Lives Matter as a mantra while decoupling ourselves from the movement and portions of it that might be in conflict? But in my opinion, in 2020, like, we've been saying Black Lives Matter for a while now, right? And the Black Lives Matter organization actually isn't even one that is as active as it used to be. But I know you'd like to talk about this, so.
Yeah, so Black Lives Matter as a mantra, just very quickly, and the hashtag actually didn't start off with law enforcement killing a Black person. It actually started with Trayvon Martin with a wannabe vigilante, right? And then it came and surfaced back up with the police murder of Mike Brown in Ferguson, and when it came to come back up. And Black Lives Matter, we shouldn't have a problem with that. I mean, the mantra and the slogan came up, Black Lives Matter, because the reality in America is Black lives have never mattered as much as white lives. So it's a statement of affirmation about the sanctity of Black life is just as important as white life. لَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. Like, this is an ayah and a principle that we have in our holy texts in the Quran. The actual Black Lives Matter movement is very loose and very nebulous, if I can use that word. And on the local level, it's not like the ACLU or not like CARE, where you have local chapters that have their own separate 501c3s and a governing type of structure, right? But there is the Black Lives Matter 501c3, right? So I would say that one can support Black life and one can show up with Black people and not necessarily support the 501c3 Black Lives Matter organization, which many Black activists have had questions about that organization's transparency and its integrity. And then from the perspective of our sacred law, there are certain things that have come up in their platform that are from the Munkarat that we simply can't promote as Muslims in the name of so-called intersectionality, right? We just simply can't do that, and I think that's very clear without me going into the into the specifics. But supporting Black life and supporting the organization Black Lives Matter, those are not the same thing, right? And Allah knows best.
Does anyone have a book suggestion on immigrant right and the relationship between immigrant rights and Black civil rights? If not, I think someone could probably just Google.
Yeah, and I mean, not exactly that, but I would recommend Everybody Was Kung Fu Fighting by Vijay Prashad. It's like Afro-Asian myths of purity or something like that. A really interesting book that details a history of solidarity between Black folks in the US and folks from the subcontinent.
Everybody Was Kung Fu, Vijay Prashad, right?
Vijay Prashad, yeah. Everybody Was Kung Fu Fighting.
Awesome. I think a big question is about, we talked about systemic racism. So what does systemic change look like? Are there any policy proposals or that kind of those more marathon goals? Mark kind of talked a lot about defunding the police. Is there anything else that we should have on our radar here to take cues from our Black Muslim brothers and sisters?
I just one that comes to the top of my head that I kind of already spoke to. I think at an extremely local level and at a masjid level, it's really important for our larger communities to start thinking seriously about our interactions with the police. I mean, I don't think that Black men, Black women, Black communities, period, should have to stress anymore that the fact that like calling a cop on a Black person could literally end their life, as we've seen and as we've continued to see. I think it's extremely important for Masajid to pay attention to this, and to not necessarily just wait for these concerns to come to this, but to actively think about this as they're implementing programs. I use Ramadan as a perfect example. Obviously, this one was different and unique, but we eventually will go back, and Tarawih will look a certain way. I think it's important for us to prioritize that. I think at a policy level, that's something that is immediately within our control. And just in general, what our relationship looks like with law enforcement, period. I think is something that needs to be paid a lot of attention to, and we need to start thinking seriously about community policing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think folks should like do the basic things that you can do to impact federal policy. So Brian Schatz is going to introduce an amendment to the Defense Authorization Act, stopping the Pentagon from sending weapons to local police departments. You should call your senators and push for that. You know, there are basic things you can do. I just want to reiterate that at a two things. Like number one, these things are more nuanced and complicated than we think a lot of times. Like literally, if you were really like in the trenches, like you would be building relationships with Muslims who are doing justice work in a city like Detroit. And then you wouldn't abstractly be asking, what can I commit to? I would be introducing you to my guy who's doing work in X area, and you might realize that he's a human and you disagree with him on some things, but that y'all can actually work on a lot of stuff constructively, right? You go to work with people every single day, most of us, who have fundamental disagreements with us about the very nature of God. And yet we work with those people day in and day out toward a common purpose that's much less significant in a lot of cases than ending rampant extrajudicial police killings of Black folks in this country. So I'll just, and you know, I know we're wrapping up on time. Like when we talk about the significance of going through Black Muslims, it's twofold. Number one, you can really be hurting the dawah among Black people if you haven't done the necessary anti-racist work in your own heart, and you're showing up in spaces with humility, with arrogance, and presuming you know all the answers, and then trying to, and then you're erasing the experience that we bring as Black Muslims to those spaces. You're erasing the fact that actually for us, a lot of us who are converts especially, Islam was a part of our anti-racist journey, right? Islam helped us get over some of that inferiority complex that racism, that white supremacy enforces on people of color. Islam helped us understand our relationship to Allah in the final day and what justice means. And you'll miss that whole part of the conversation if you try to circumvent us. So I just wanted to share those things.
Thank you. And Mark, I think that legislation you talked about was from Representative Schatz, and it was on DOMA, right?
This was from Senator Brian Schatz, and this was on the NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act.
Got it.
Yeah.
Thank you for repeating that. Okay, and then this is going to be the last question, and then we'll close out with dua, inshallah. But I thought this was really profound. Whenever I read up or meet an individual who expands my knowledge on matters of Black oppression, I find myself shackled in how imaginative I can be in my response. This can be attributed to the fact that the oppression being challenged came before me, and therefore my frame of thinking is also highly influenced by that which I am challenging. So how can one demand Black liberation while also breaking the internal shackles that have been set due to being part of the system?
And this is the final question, Ria?
I thought it was a good one, but
okay, no, it's a good one. I just wanted to know if this was the final one. So I'll, quickly, I will say, number one, this is one reason that national policies like defund the police are actually important, because they help expand the national imagination. We have to understand that every day there are people who are trying to set the frame, the limits for what we think is viable, or is possible, or is likely, is rational in this country. And again, while you may not agree with every single policy that might be covered under a general banner of defund the police, I guarantee there are very significant ones that would reduce police violence, that while not endangering our communities, that you would actually agree with, at the level that they play out and are being proposed in your local communities. So that's, one thing. We just have to be willing to think more broadly and to expand those boundaries. And then again, I would say you find inspiration for the work that it takes to clear our hearts in the words like which Imam Dawood has been sharing over the last few days, or some of the other shuyukh who I mentioned earlier. That's where you find like that sort of inspiration, but it really is a practice. Like it really is reminding yourself on a daily basis to challenge the small biases that you see in your own behavior, to stop lying to yourself, to stop making excuses or defenses for yourself, right? Again, it's a daily practice. And just like you might go through a daily practice to improve any other habit, you need to go through a daily practice to unlearn racism in this country. And then I'll just close by saying knowledge is really key here. Right, Malcolm X has a quote where he says, and this is about not being disparaging to other people. He said, you have to remember there was a time when you didn't know what you know today, right? We all learn. We're all on a path seeking more and more nearness to truth and understanding of what truth is. And you got to be patient with yourself and with other folks. And that's one thing that often differentiates our disposition when we come to activist spaces as people of faith, and particularly as Muslims. Like, we believe in redemption, not for ourselves and for other folks that we're engaging with. And then I'll just, lastly, this quote from a guy named David Hunt, who's an organizer and strategist in the housing space. He says, don't defend old decisions against newly discovered information, right? Don't defend old decisions against newly discovered information. Give yourself space to learn, give yourself space to forgive yourself, and let go of defenses about things that you can rightfully say you weren't fully informed about.
Yeah, and I know we're wrapping up on time. Just one quick point, I think, as it relates to imaginative solutions, and something that I myself have been working through. So this really resonates with me. I think a good thing is to remember that a lot of these things that we're talking about, like there was a time when they didn't exist. I think a lot of times we like to talk about these things because it is all that we've known, as if they have to be, right? I work in like the immigration space, and what I'll ultimately be doing. And like ICE was created in 2003. Like my little sister is older than that, right? Like this idea that because this is what we know, because this is the kind of enforcement that we see, this is what it has to be, is just not true. And we know that by virtue of how long it has existed for, and that at the end of the day, someone put that in place, and that we can take them away should we find necessary.
I guess I'll make a closing comment too, and as it relates to this discussion. And if we look at the Quran, we see that the Quran is a book that's very comprehensive, and the Quran does have ahkam, meaning rules or laws. And the Quran also has limited places where it talks about hudud, or actual judicial punishments. But the majority of the Quran is not about laws or about adjudication and punishment. Much of the Quran is talking about connecting us with God, spiritual purification, which leads us to have ethical lives, right? So I am all for public policy, and I work with this and advocate for this at CARE. As a matter of fact, on Monday, there's going to be a Zoom commission hearing relating to the facial recognition technology in the city of Detroit that's being used by the Detroit Police Department. We're a part of that. So public policy and laws are very important. Court cases are very important. But anti-Black racism cannot be legislated nor adjudicated away. It cannot be marched away, though marching's important and organizing protests. I've organized many protests. But that alone, at the roots of it, America has a cultural problem that's informed by spiritual maladies, right? So this is part of the issue that we have to deal with for the long haul. But how can we also imagine as Muslims that we don't follow everyone else in their rhetoric, everyone else in their discourse, and that we can bring forth a message to help purify the culture in the United States of America, to help heal sick hearts that are wallowing in disease with the cancer of arrogance and pride, with envy and with greed. That are really the spiritual maladies. They're at the heart of al-Unsuriya, or what we know as racism, right? If we look at it from a Ghazalian type of perspective, right? So that's, and this is where we all come in, have to play the part. of exemplifying Islam, and to try to work to model something different that people can see in the American society that's an alternative to the ever-growing materialistic, animalistic thought processes in the United States of America, and the what I call the nihilistic activism that is, in many cases, has no level of sanctity to it, but is very profane in its outlook, very materialistic, right? We are people that believe that physical manifestations are have deeper metaphysical realities behind them, right? We're a people of faith. We're just not a people of materialism. So I just wanted to say that we need to be involved, but as I will conclude, as Dr. Sherman Abdul Hakim Jackson has said to us many years, Hafidhullah, is that hard work is the hard work. Hard work is the hard work, and that starts with hard work in our homes, with our families, in our community, and with people we work with, right? That's the hardest work, really, is the hard work. So may Allah help us and strengthen us in the hard work.
Yeah, and it brings to mind Dr. Jackson also saying that you're not going to change the world by day if you're not praying by night, right? And that's the first action item for me, is that this should change the way that we pray. This should change the way we read the Quran. This should change the way that we worship. And nothing else is going to get done if we don't fix that first. Thank you all so much. You all gave of your time and you gave of yourselves. I just thought this was really incredible. So Jazakumullah khair. I think on that note, we ought to end in dua. So maybe
Shreya, one quick question before not question, but just a reminder that tomorrow, one of the things I just want to, again, first of all, I want to thank Ria for coming on and doing such a great job moderating. Alhamdulillah. Yes, I know. Sometimes we just got to say it, like, alhamdulillah, this is our future, our youth coming up and, growing up in front of our eyes. But, mashallah, we want to keep on seeing our generations participating and engaging. So alhamdulillah for that. I got a lot of comments on that. I also want to just thank again the MTWS community, the Canton community, and everybody else that joined and engaged. Alhamdulillah. That's it's nice to see everybody. I think we had an estimate of about 230 people watching, alhamdulillah, on YouTube as well as here. So we had good engagement, but that's not something to pat ourselves on the back on. Alhamdulillah, that's good. Inshallah, we will continue to engage. And so we already see that this was not even enough time to cover. We just scratched the surface. So inshallah, we're going to be looking at different ways. Somebody already suggested that we should post some books for reading and education. Inshallah, we will work on that and post that, and look out for some of the future programs that we will be doing this. Towards in that vein, tomorrow, ICNA Social Justice and MCWS as a co-sponsor is having a program at 1 p.m. I know Dawood and Mark, you're gonna have to get some rest and then just get up and do it again. I know you're back to back on a lot of these things, subhanAllah. But so Dawood and Mark will be involved in that as well. So you can just go to iknasj.com/live, and that will be on at 1 p.m. With that, I'll let Ria, you can have somebody make closing dua, inshallah.
Yeah, this is something that we learned from Dr. Ware, is that in West Africa, it's the men who lead salah, but the women who do dua. So if Nabintu, you wouldn't mind just making a quick dua for us.
Put me on the spot.
Not to put you on the spot.
سبحانك اللهم بحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. Ya Allah, we ask that you make us amongst those who see truth as truth and give us the ability to follow it. We ask that you show us falsehood as falsehood and give us the ability to refrain from it. Ameen. Jazakallah khair, you guys.
Jazakallah khair.
Thank you so much, MCWS. Again.
All right. Assalamu alaikum, everybody.
Assalamu alaikum.